Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. I want to remind you guys to remember to like and share these videos so that others can find them and watch them. And please remember to subscribe to the channel. And for those who have already subscribed, I thank you very much. And also a shout out to those who made note to me that I pronounced the capital city in my last video incorrectly. Instead of Corboda, it is Cordoba. So I thank you for catching that and hitting me up on that. I really appreciate it. In today's story, we're going to talk about a little boy who grew up to live out one of his biggest dreams. We all dream of moving somewhere other than our home and living there and having this wonderful life. Well, this gentleman right here was able to do just that. His name is Eugene Bullard, and Eugene was born in Columbus, Georgia on October 9th, 1895. He was the seventh of 10 children. His father was William Bullard, and his mother was Josephine Thomas, or Josephine Bullard. Now, his father's ancestors had been enslaved in Virginia and Georgia, and his mother was of African American and Muskogee descent. Now, Eugene attended school in Columbus, Georgia from 1901 to 1906. He stayed in school up to the 5th grade. But unfortunately, as a child, he witnessed his father almost being lynched. His father was attacked by a white mob, and they tried to lynch him for what is said was a workplace dispute. This, along with just seeing how blacks were treated in the U.S., was really discouraging to Eugene, and the U.S. was just not someplace he really wanted to live. So when he was 11 years old, in the year 1906, he ran away from home. Now, young Eugene arrived in Atlanta, Georgia, where he worked for a British clan of gypsies named the Stanleys. He worked for them tending to their horses, and he learned to race horses as well. Now, Eugene's ultimate goal was to leave the U.S. and get to Europe, where he hoped he could escape the racism of the U.S. And the Stanleys, being from Britain, was his hope that he could leave with them, but they had no plans of returning, at least at that time, back to their home in Britain. So Eugene left them and he went to work with the Turner family in Dawson, Georgia as a stable boy. And in 1912, he traveled to Norfolk, Virginia, and he stowed away on a German freighter called the Martha Russ. And Eugene arrived in Aberdeen, Scotland. From there, he went to Glasgow and then on to London. He settled in London for a short time period where he worked as a slapstick performer in the African American entertainment troupe called the Belle Davis's Freedmen Pickaninnies. He also worked as a boxer. He was trained under the famous boxer Dixie Kid. And it was the Dixie Kid who arranged a fight for Eugene in Paris. Once in Paris, Eugene really fell in love with the place, so he decided to settle in Paris. And he continued to box while he was in Paris, and he also worked in a music hall. And he actually commented on his time in Paris in an interview, stating, and I quote, "It seemed to me that French democracy influenced the minds of both black and white Americans there and helped us all act like brothers." End quote. In August of 1914, World War I began, and Eugene enlisted in the French Foreign Legion. At this time, foreigners could not enlist in the military. So if you were not a French citizen, you could only enlist in the French Foreign Legion. So that is what he did, and he was assigned to the 3rd Marching Regiment. And in 1915, he was a machine gunner and was sent to combat on the Somme front in Picardy. From there, he was sent to Artois in May and June. And then in the fall, he fought in the Second Battle of Champagne. He had been assigned to a few different regiments. He was eventually assigned to the 170th Infantry Regiment. And it is with them that Eugene went on and he fought in the Battle of Verdun, and he was seriously wounded. He was sent to Lyon to recuperate from his wound. In fact, during his time in the field, he was injured 3 times, and he kept going back to fight before he received this serious injury in March 1916 at Verdun. Now, he had lost most of his teeth, and he had a hole in his thigh from the artillery shell. And doctors told Eugene that he might not walk again, but he was a fighter and he never gave up, and that really didn't faze him one bit. Now, during his recovery, he was cited for acts of valor, and on July 3rd, 1917, he was awarded the Croix de Guerre, which was a Medal of Honor. So the Croix de Guerre was awarded to him on July 3rd, 1917, one of his first medals. He would go on to receive many others after that. But getting back to his recovery, during the time that he was recovering, he was put on leave and he went to Paris. And there he made a bet with a friend for $2,000 that despite his color, he could enlist in the French flying service. So he learned to fly, and on October 2nd, 1916, he volunteered for the French Air Service, and he was accepted. So he went through training at the Aerial Gunnery School in Cazaux, Gironde. He went through flight training after this, and he received his pilot's license number 6950, on May 5th, 1917, from the Aero Club de France. After obtaining his pilot's license, he went on to receive more training, and he joined the Lafayette Flying Corps on November 15, 1916. This was an all-American flying group, and this group of American pilots flew with French pilots on different military missions during the war. Eventually, Eugene was promoted to corporal on June 28, 1917, and he flew with different squadrons, and he took part in over 20 combat missions. And he flew with a mascot, a rhesus monkey named Jimmy. You can see Jimmy in the photo on the airplane next to Eugene. Now in 1917, the U.S. entered the war. So now the U.S. has entered World War I. And Eugene tried to join the U.S. Air Service because he is a U.S. citizen and he wanted to fight for his country. But he was not accepted due to his color. Only white pilots were chosen. So at some point later on, Eugene, who was still now serving with the French forces, he went on break in Paris. And during his leave, he got into an argument with a French commissioned officer. And his punishment for this was that he was sent back to the 170th Infantry in January 1918. And he served there until he was discharged on October 24th, 1919. Eugene received multiple medals during his service in the French military. And after the war, he returned back to Paris, where he worked for 4 years as a jazz drummer in a nightclub named Zealous. And he himself eventually owned his own nightclub that was named Le Grand Deux. And he also owned an American-style bar named L'Escardille. And he also operated an athletic club. So he owned a few businesses of his own. So he was doing quite well at this time. On July 17th, 1923, he married a French woman named Marcelle Eugenie Henriette Stroman. And they had two daughters, Jacqueline and Lolita. They divorced on December 5th, 1935. And in 1939, September, World War II began. And the French government asked Bullard to spy on the German citizens who frequented his clubs. Now, because Eugene could speak German, he would be able to listen to their conversations and relay anything of importance back to the French government. So he began working as a spy. As we know, the Germans eventually invaded France in May of 1940. At this point, Eugene volunteered for the military again. So he served in the French military as a machine gunman or a machine gunner in the 51st Infantry. And during battle, Eugene was severely wounded again by an exploding artillery shell. So now at this point, I think that this man has 9 lives like a cat. Not many people can say that they were hit with artillery shell twice and lived, but he was, and he did. But after being injured, he was afraid that he would be captured by the Germans, so he made his way to Spain, and in July 1940, he returned to the United States. Now, the war and the siege on France by the Germans had destroyed his businesses and his property. And so he was not able to recover that. But he did receive compensation for his loss by the French government. So he used that money and he took it and he settled in the famous Harlem, New York. Now, upon arriving in the U.S., he did spend some time in a hospital in New York, but he never really fully recovered from his wound. And while he lived in New York, he worked in various odd and end jobs. One, for example, he worked as a perfume salesman, he worked as a security guard, and he also worked as an interpreter for Louis Armstrong. Eugene had made some very good contacts while he was in Harlem, and he was friends with some of the famous people there at the time, like Louis Armstrong, who he worked as an interpreter for. He was also connected with Paul Robeson. Now, in 1949, Paul Robeson was going to hold a concert in Peekskill, New York. But that concert turned into what we now call the Peekskill riots. Eugene attended this concert. Now, it was going to take place on August 27th, 1949. But before Robeson arrived, a mob attacked the concert goers with baseball bats and rocks and stones, and 13 people were seriously injured. Eugene was one of those 13 who was seriously injured. He was knocked to the ground and beaten by an angry mob. And this mob consisted of state and local law enforcement. Ironically, this attack was caught on film, and there are pictures and film of Eugene actually being attacked, as you can see the pictures here in this video. Some of the film was displayed in the 1970s documentary, The Tallest Tree in Our Forest. And they were also utilized in the documentary that was narrated by Sidney Poitier called Paul Robeson, Tribute to an Artist. No one was prosecuted for the attack that was carried out on him. Now, I mentioned that this attack was carried out by state and local law enforcement. You can see in the video, um, there are two policemen, a state trooper, and concert goers that attacked him. And, all of this and seeing the racism going on in the U.S., he was just deeply disillusioned with the U.S. So he returned to France sometime after this concert. But he was unable to resume his former life there. Now, in 1954, he was one of three men chosen to relight the everlasting flame at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Paris. So he was invited and he attended that. And then in 1959, he was given the highest decoration that you could bestow on anyone by France. And that was that he was made a Knight of the Legion of Honor. He made his way back to the U.S. at some point, and Eugene worked as an elevator operator at the Rockefeller Center. No one knew who he was. No one knew what his accomplishments were. He was just kind of, there in the background working. But someone eventually discovered who he was and what he had done, and he was eventually invited to the Today Show for an interview. So he appeared on one of the episodes of the Today Show, the episode that aired on 12/22/1959, or that is December 22nd, 1959. And he appeared in his elevator man's uniform. At this point in his life, his daughters were now adults and no longer living with him. One of them was actually married at this point, and he found himself alone in his small apartment, basically just surrounded by his pictures and medals and memories of the life he had back in France. And he never recovered to that life that he had before. He never got that happiness back. And he eventually died on October 12th, 1961, at the age of 66 years old. He died of stomach cancer, and he was buried with military honors in the French War Veterans section of Flushing Cemetery in New York. In 1989, he was posthumously inducted into the Georgia Aviation Hall of Fame. On August 23, 1994, 77 years after he had been rejected by his own country to represent them and fly for them in World War I, he was posthumously commissioned a second lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force. On October 9, 2019, a statue was erected in his honor at the Museum of Aviation in Warner Robins, Georgia. And in his hometown of Columbus, Georgia, a sign was erected talking about his early life. In 2022, Eugene Bullard was inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame in Dayton, Ohio. Eugene Jacques Bullard is one of the first Black fighter pilots. His life was really great for him in Paris, and he was highly decorated in his lifetime for his accomplishments while in France. But in his own homeland, he was ignored in his lifetime. He endured being beaten at a concert, things he'd never experienced in Paris. But in his own country, posthumously, they eventually honored him. He had a dream, but that dream was only achievable outside of his homeland of America. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's story, and please give it a thumbs up if you liked it. So remember, like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to click the notification bell so you can be updated on new videos that I release. And as always, I will see you soon.